I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. We're back. I'm back, I should say.
It's been 2 weeks for you.
Yeah. Been busy coding and some life stuff. You know, it happens sometimes, but we are back.
Yeah.
I'm back. Lucy's been here all along.
I've been here, but it's great to have you back. I really missed you as my co-host.
I missed being here. Yeah, I'm back, not dolled up and showered. Like, Lucy, you look wonderful. But I do have a college hat on, which I felt was very apropos for our topic today.
Yes. Your alma mater.
My alma mater. I have my Notre Dame hat on, and it's also covering up my greasy hair. So 2 birds, 1 stone.
Amazing. I mean, if you had not said anything, I would have just guessed you were on theme.
We'll go with that.
So today's topic is if college is still worth it. I feel like this has been in the news a lot lately.
Totally.
And so as 2 college graduates, we wanted to weigh in and also enlighten ourselves, because when I was in high school, I never even thought about any other option other than college. For me, it was like, okay, are you going to get into an Ivy League school or not? Not if you're going to go to college. It was always taken for granted that that's something I was going to do. And now I'm seeing just like a lot more options out there and people asking themselves if it is worth it to go to college, especially for kids who are paying their own way and having to take on debt. Because in my situation, my parents paid for school. I did grow up in Michigan, so I paid in-state tuition at U of M, which part of that was a cost decision. Like, I was really only applying to schools where it's either Michigan or Harvard. That's the only leap where like my parents would be like, okay, maybe we'll help pay for Harvard, but like we're not going to send you to Northwestern or a similar kind of level school as Michigan if it's out of state, because it would have been 3 to 4 times the cost.
Yeah, totally. I had a very similar experience where I went to an all-girls Catholic school for high school, and it was very college prep. The sole purpose was to get you into an elite university. And everyone was either going to the Ivies or, I mean, I went to high school in Milwaukee. So the sort of elite institutions around that area are, of course, like Notre Dame, Northwestern, U Chicago. And yeah, it didn't even cross my mind to not go to college. Like, my sole purpose of existing was like, okay, get good grades so you can go to college. I even remember being in high school and being like, I don't even know what I want after college, because like my life has revolved around just getting into a good school my entire life.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I feel like in other countries, there's maybe more of a norm that you can go into a trade school, or like that's an actual conversation somebody will sit down and have with you, whether that's like a school counselor or what, in like middle school or high school. But in the US, everyone gets put on the path to college. And it's not necessarily what's best for the student. I just have this memory of like high school. I was in French class and my French teacher saying that the French school system is incredibly different than the American one. And actually, it's not assumed that everyone will go to college.
Yeah. So you even decide before you go to high school, basically, if you're going to college. So in France, Italy, the Netherlands, there's different levels of high school. And those high schools can be vocational high schools. So you literally go to like culinary high school, and like at the end of it, you're going to be like in hospitality. Like, you're learning something completely different than like the college prep track.
Totally. Okay. Yeah, that's what she was saying. And I remember being shocked by that when I was in high school, because I was like, I don't even know what I want to be when I grow up. And you're telling me that like in Europe, they decide in middle school if they're like going to specialize. And at the time I was like, that seems crazy. Like, how would you know? Okay. So because what year did you do abroad in Italy? You did sophomore year?
Sophomore year of high school. Yeah.
Okay. So at that point, everyone had selected or...
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The school I was in was called a scientific school. So they were studying primarily math and science, but it was still like liberal arts. I had friends that were in language school, and you would study like less math and science, and you would literally take 4 languages. Like, you're studying like European languages, or like sometimes there was like ones that were like classical humanities, but those were all leading you to college. I did 2 weeks at one of those hospitality ones where it was vocational, and literally they were making cocktails for class.
That's amazing.
It was amazing. Yeah. They were like, this is how you make a cocktail. And then I'm like, what are you guys going to do? They're like, oh, we're going to work in the tourism industry when we graduate. Like, there was no concept of going to college, and nobody wanted to either. They were like, yeah, screw that. I don't want that. But the people who were in those more educational programs went on to earn like master's degrees and stuff. Because even just getting a bachelor's degree isn't enough to actually get you a job because it's free. A lot of people do it. You really have to go on to get like your master's or PhD to actually get some sort of job out of college.
That's so interesting because, like, I mean, you have obviously schools like Cornell has a hospitality school and they also learn how to make cocktails as part of their college classes. But I think it's like so smart to do it earlier because our high school
I
experience in the
agree.
US is so focused on pre-college. Your English classes are books you're going to be tested on in like the SAT, right? And like building your
Yeah,
vocabulary for that. And if you're not trying to go to college, like why why is that useful for you at all?
totally. Totally. I agree.
Well, okay. So you definitely validated that memory of my French teacher that was like why I wanted to do this episode because I was like, I've seen all this in the news, but I'm also like, does it have to be this way? Why does it feel so fraught in America? And it doesn't have to be this super classist system where if you didn't go to college, you're like looked down upon.
Yeah, completely.
The number one reason students go to college is for employability and to obtain a financially secure future. The take that I feel like has gotten more popular recently is that it's just not worth it anymore. And there's multiple reasons people cite, such as tuition getting more expensive, the proliferation of those shady for-profit colleges that I remember seeing a lot of ads for, obviously the increasing student loan debt, and just like with the waves that we've also been experiencing in the economy, not feeling like a college degree guarantees you a job the same way it maybe did for your parents' generation. So, yeah, I think the shape of the conversation today will be what the college landscape really looks like in the US. And then we'll wrap it up with the other options other than going to college in the form of trade schools, apprenticeships, coding boot camps.
Which I myself am a boot camp graduate.
Mhm.
So I kind of got that double dip going on.
Yeah.
So yeah, very excited to talk about boot camps and apprenticeships.
So, to start, how do people feel about college nowadays? The Wall Street Journal did this poll in 2023 of about 1,000 people and found that 56% of Americans think earning a 4-year degree is no longer worth it.
Really?
Yeah, the majority.
That's so many people.
They did this same survey in 2017, and at that point, the doubt over the value of college was really the greatest amongst men, Republicans, and people living in rural areas, which is kind of where I thought we still were. Like, if you live in a rural area and most people in your town are doing jobs that don't require a college degree because they have trades, then maybe it makes sense that you would think there's plenty of other options. Why would I pay a bunch of money to go to college? But actually now, like in 2023, the skepticism has spread to all age groups, residents of cities and suburbs. The only category of people who still have a slim majority that they still have faith in college is Democrats, those with a college degree, and then those earning more than $100,000 a year.
Basically the beneficiaries of the system.
Yeah, so we're talking like the
Yes.
liberal elites are the ones who are
Yes.
still slim majority, right? So this is still like 42% of people with college degrees said in this most recent survey in 2023 that it wasn't worth it, which was up 10 percentage points from 2 polls in the last decade.
That's so many people.
Okay, so that's the state of the union. The big question is, why has it become this way, right? Like, clearly, we didn't always feel this way in America. Well, I think one factor is obviously the cost has gone up. And I was curious, like, okay, is it just inflation? Like, what is really driving the cost of schools? I always hear that it's getting a lot more expensive. And they even have those programs where, like, as soon as you have a baby, you can lock in their college rate.
What?
Yeah. You didn't know this? Yeah.
Is that like at the state university? Because I can't imagine, like, how do you even?
Yeah, there's state savings programs. So, like, Michigan has a program where if you're living in Michigan, you have a baby, and you think they're most likely going to go to college in state, you can lock in their tuition rate now, start paying in installments so that by the time they're 18, you've covered their tuition and they're not paying the inflated rates later on.
So they like guarantee admission or something too?
No, they don't guarantee admission. Like, if your kid doesn't get in, you can pass it along to a sibling, but to actually get a refund, it depends on that state's policy. Sometimes you can get your money back, or if your kid ends up going to college out of state, you can transfer some of it with a penalty.
Well, hopefully with interest.
Yeah, I don't know all the details, but there were people my year in school whose parents had put them on that plan.
No way. I didn't know this was a thing.
I know. It kind of is like, do you really have a choice then at that point what school you go to?
Absolutely not. No.
Yeah, so if we look at the numbers, So this is tuition only. Public four-year colleges are now 2.25 times the cost of what they were when we were born. So in the last 30 years, it has more than doubled, adjusted for inflation. For private four-year nonprofits, that increase is 1.8 times. And for public two-year schools, it is 1.65 times. So
I'm
it
honestly
is,
surprised it's not bigger. Like in my imagination, the boomers paid like a raspberry to go to college. So they just even like the fact that it's only double. I'm like, I thought it would be like triple, quadruple. But
yeah, I mean, this is tuition only. When you add in your lodging, your books, your meals, like all of the
true.
cost of actually being a student, I was looking at like the actual numbers. I was like, this is sticker shock. To go to a four-year private college, all in tuition plus room board, all the typical college student fees, you're looking at $58,000 a year, which is crazy.
Wild. Wild.
Yeah, when you look at those numbers, it's like kind of makes sense why you maybe want to lock it in now for your kid, if you can.
Oh my God.
Okay, so if you know that you're going to pay all this money to go to college, and it is more expensive now than it was for your parents, the question is, are the benefits still worth it? If I didn't go to college and I just try to get a job after high school, do my lifetime earnings as a high school graduate balance out with my lifetime earnings as a college graduate, given I may also have student loan debt?
Mm.
What do you think the data is going to say?
I don't think it's going to be worth it once you factor in all that. Am I right? Sadly.
Well, okay, so I do want to be clear. If you look at lifetime earnings, the differences are huge. So a 2011 study looked at differences in lifetime earnings between someone with a bachelor's degree compared to someone just with a high school diploma. And the bachelor's degree got you 84% more earnings over your lifetime compared to the high school diploma.
That makes sense.
And that has actually gone up. So in 1999, it was 75% more. So if you put that into numbers, it is pretty stark, right? Like the estimated lifetime earnings of a high school diploma holder are $1.3 million. That is $2.3 million for someone who has a bachelor's degree. And actually the trend holds for higher education as well. So a master's degree is 2.7 million, a doctoral degree is 3.3 million. So if you do get more higher education, like the jobs that you are able to apply for and gain employment for do pay more, right? Now, what I think is actually more interesting, though, is if you look at those first couple years out of school, where like you're working an entry-level job, and we're not talking like lifetime earnings here. You're just talking about how much money you make per year, because I think a lot of people do think that way, right? Not everyone is like looking, oh, well, in 50 years, I'm going to, have this much money. Like people are like, okay, like I need to think about providing for myself today. And like, if I go to school and I also have to pay student loans, like my monthly income, how does that actually compare with if I didn't take on that expense? And here's where I think it gets pretty interesting. So we know that the median earnings for a college grad are about $25,000 higher per year than a high school grad. But we also know that there's a lot of student loan debt. So there was this study that looked at about 4,000 college institutions and more than 5 million students. And they looked at the median earnings 10 years after they entered college. So this is like you're an early professional. You're in the first 5 years of your career. And they compared it against high school graduates along all these different factors. Earnings of a typical high school graduate are about $32,000 per year. And you can kind of think of that as like the minimum wage. A $15 minimum wage times 50 work weeks is $30,000 per year.
Yeah.
What the study showed is actually over 1,000 of these institutions, so 27%, show that the majority of their students fail to earn as much as a typical high school graduate 10 years after they've enrolled in college. Less than half of the schools, 44%, show an earnings premium of even $10,000 or more for those who attended.
What does that mean, even $10,000 more?
Let's say a high school grad makes $32K. If I look at $42K, $10,000 more,
Yeah.
then you're ruling out half of the schools in this study.
Okay. I see.
That made it worth it.
I see. Wow.
Yeah, so I was pretty shocked by that. This study is basically saying that in these 4,000 schools they looked at, half of them, that person probably should not have gone to college if they were only looking at it from like an earnings perspective compared to having a high school diploma.
Totally. And I feel like that feels more intuitively correct because when we're talking about all these stats of like lifetime earnings, who's making a bunch of money, like master's degrees, PhDs, A lot of the people that go on to make a ton of money or have beyond a bachelor's degree are mostly professionals, right? So we're talking like lawyers, doctors, and not just, the person who had a bachelor's degree in the humanities. It's like a very different landscape. But also, like, even with the difference in school, like if you went to Harvard and got a philosophy degree, you could still probably go get a finance job because you went to Harvard and you have the connections. But if you went to like, I don't know, Ohio State and got a philosophy degree, like that's a much different landscape even then.
Yeah.
So there's like so much nuance with this stuff. It makes it really difficult to even dig into the numbers and like truly understand them. So like that actually does make a lot of sense to me, because it's like, what percentage of people are actually going after these degrees that get you like a really defined specific job? Like you're going not to get an education, but to get training for the workforce. It's a totally different mindset.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really interesting point. You're kind of saying two different things, right? You're saying like, one, it really depends what you're studying in college and how that affects your earnings after, right? Like if you're doing something with clear job prospects versus something where there's not a direct connection, like an English degree, and you don't want to become an English professor, it might be harder for you to get a job after school. And then the other point you're making is it really depends what kind of school you're going to. Like the reality is this study took 4,000 colleges, but it's including associate degrees and bachelor degrees, right? It's including public and private institutions. And if you break that down, what does that look like? I think those are great points, and we're going to talk about both of them. So to start with the second, right, with this study in particular, they actually provide all of the data, which I love when studies do this. So I actually just downloaded it into Excel and like looked myself.
Investigative journalism.
I mean, this is because I did study business, so I know how to use Excel. I'm making the point right here. But I looked at the 4,000 schools, and first, what's actually in this data set? And actually it included associate degrees, bachelor degrees, and certificates. So immediately I was like, what's a certificate? And looking deeper, it looked like a lot of trade schools. So there were cosmetology schools, a lot of nursing institutions, and these programs were several months rather than a 2-year associates. So to me, that's more of an alternative option rather than how I think most high schoolers think about college. So I removed certificate schools, and after doing that, the pool is actually about 2,500 colleges that are bachelor or associate degrees. So it's still both 2-year and 4-year. 95% of those 2,500 schools, you do make more than a high school graduate. And about 52% of those schools show an earnings premium of at least $10,000. It's still not super promising because only half of the time are you even making $10,000 more. Okay, so then I looked at, let me take out associates. Let me look at only 4-year institutions, both public and private. That was around 1,600 schools. And 79% of those schools got you an earnings premium of at least $10,000. Okay, so looking a little bit better. However, now you're talking a 4-year school. You got to also start to think about debt. The average debt for going to a 4-year institution is $29,000. And that's before any interest, right? And obviously interest differs for every person depending on how long it takes you to pay it back. So I don't think $10,000 more is a good approximation. Let's set a higher bar and use the $29,000 as the goal for medium income 10 years after enrollment. So to make at least $29,000 higher annually than a high school grad, which is pre-tax and doesn't include interest, so you still wouldn't be able to pay off all your debt in 1 year. But I think it's useful just as a comparison. How many of these schools would actually get you there? So of those 1,600 4-year colleges, only 370 would meet that bar.
Wow. Oh, that's so sad.
So yeah, that's not a lot. My takeaway from this was like, okay, it's easy to talk in generalizations. As I was doing research, I saw stats and claims thrown out to support every single perspective. And I think the reality is it's really about the nuance and in the details. Like some schools are worth it and some schools are absolutely not worth it. So it really depends like what your goals are and like what school you're going to. And you really need to do research on like the specific institution that you are interested in. And what you study matters a lot too. So out of the 10 top schools in this list of 4,000 that had the highest median student earnings, 7 were STEM-focused schools where you earn a Bachelor of Science. So there's a clear path to a higher paying job than a liberal arts degree.
But I feel like there's something so fundamentally different about like getting an education versus job training. I have to give Einstein a shout out here because he has a quote that really encapsulates how I think about education. Einstein said, "Education is not a learning of facts, but a training of the mind to think." And I subscribe to this 100%. So to me going to my boot camp and learning how to code was not education. That was me getting trained in a skill. But my liberal arts degree was an education. Like, I can't even tell you half the facts that I learned in my liberal arts degree, but I know how to think now. I know how to read a study. I know how to have ambiguous thoughts. And that sort of training can only be done in like a group setting in person. Like, that's not something that you can do on an online course. Even like Zoom University, I really question how much you can do that. Like, you kind of have to be in this lecture hall liberal arts setting. I think that is so valuable and is really undermined in the conversation of how much money are you making after college. And I also think that there's this really unfortunate conflation of education and job training where we want people to have college degrees for jobs that really don't require college degrees. So for instance, we have customer service reps who like, do you need to have a college degree for that? No, you probably just need incredible social skills and emotional intelligence, and that you can get outside of the context of college. But we've lost touch of what it means to have an education. And I think the purpose of it is to just make you a well-rounded human being.
I think that's like a very idealistic way of looking at it. And I think it probably holds true in countries where it's free to go to college. I mean, I agree with that, like as a philosophy or like a fundamental desire, right? I think a lot of people would appreciate the chance to have that time to like just learn. It's like a privilege. The way America is set up outside of even just the education system and the fact that we don't have government-sponsored college, but even the fact that we just have so few social safety nets and people do need to work a job just to feed themselves, right? And they can't support themselves just relying on government assistance so that they have that time to even pursue the education in the first place.
Yeah, totally. This really ties into how I think about it too, because there's that fundamental understanding of what an education should be versus what it's become due to like outside forces. I really do think that we should have free college education, but there's also a caveat here. So we can look at countries that do have free college education, like Western European countries, and they face some of the same problems we do, where a college education means nothing in terms of the job market. Like, you are basically required to have a college education to have like really, really basic jobs.
Yeah, it's just an issue of competition.
Exactly. I don't know what the answer to that problem is, but I think it lies in understanding that a college degree does not make you a good worker. It makes you a well-rounded civic participant, if that makes sense. And I know that's extremely idealistic, but that's also where the liberal arts comes from. So back in like ancient Greece and Rome, in ancient China, universities existed to prepare young men for like civic, religious, and business leadership. And they taught them skills that ranged from law to medicine to military expertise. And it wasn't really about teaching them how to do a job specifically. It was like, this is how you think and this is how you become a leader. And then that's why we kind of have that Renaissance man idea, because they had a really well-rounded education. And so that nugget of where higher education stems from didn't go away in modern day. Like, that's why we still have liberal arts degrees. That's why you still have to take a humanitarian course if you're pre-med. But how we conceptualize what an education is supposed to give you is so different. I think that mismatch is really where we're seeing the tension of, okay, yeah, you can have this English degree, but you're still going to make $20K a year, and you need to have that English degree to do some job that you really don't need it for.
Well, I guess the question is like, if you and I at least are in agreement that there's so much more to education than obviously the preparation to get a job, how much of that needs to be done in the context of a college campus? You mentioned, for example, the importance of having a professor and also peers, right, to like discuss with versus doing that learning on your own. If you were to say, just separate those two needs, like I'm going to go to a trade school so that I can get a job and fulfill my financial needs, but then I'm just going to try to do education separately. Like, I can still get an education even if I didn't go to college, right? Like, is there something special about college? Like the setting of college, the time period in which you're doing it, the fact that you're surrounded by all these peers who are similar to you, or like, can you get a similar outcome or like have a similar experience if you're just learning on your own, or maybe it's with a smaller group of peers or something? Like, to me, an interesting parallel is homeschooling. There's homeschooling, not in college necessarily, but as you're growing up, middle school, high school, versus being in a classroom environment.
I didn't look at homeschool data specifically, but I just know from like hearing about homeschooled kids that they do tend to have more social development issues. Because like, you get a lot of your socialization from being in school, and you're still developing when you're 18 to 22, those college years. And I feel like anecdotally, I absolutely gained a lot of social skill from like being away from my parents for the first time, like launched in with all of these strangers. You kind of develop. I don't think I feel like it would be like pretty elitist to say like you can't have that if you don't go to college. I think you absolutely can. I think the challenging of your mind to think in new ways is probably a lot more difficult to do on your own or with a parent, even in the homeschool example. Not to say that you absolutely can't do it, but I think it's this accelerated path, and probably like you're exposed to ideas that you wouldn't naturally be exposed to in the academic setting.
Yeah, actual data on the success of homeschooling is not really available because a lot of the studies finding positive results are funded by advocates and lobby groups. And in general, it's just a difficult area of study. So there was one non biased review paper I found looking at all of the data that we do have, which was 2,000 texts and studies. And this paper is by Robert Kunzman. He did not find anything conclusive around differences in social skills. Though academically, homeschooled students were less likely to attend selective colleges, spent fewer years in college, and wound up working in lower paying jobs. Of course, in the context of our conversation, we're talking about young people who choose to go to a trade school for the financial security and job piece, and then who are also trying to expand their mind by learning from home. And I think the success of that is really case by case. The quality of the teachers and the resources you're seeking out. Yeah, I mean, the internet has really leveled the playing field. Because you can get education now in so many other ways. Like, I think it used to
Yeah.
be before the internet, you probably did have to go to a college campus or like somehow know a professor who could educate you. But now colleges post a lot of their classes online for free. You can take Khan Academy classes. There's like so many resources out there where you can educate yourself.
I do think there's something to be said for having like a shared education. Like in France, for example, there's this huge idea of the cultural French education. And so you walk around knowing that everybody else has had the same basis of like Sartre, and like you all have this cultural understanding of each other because you all know you studied the same things. And we have like a huge fracturing of that in this country because we don't have like a standardized education, even on like the college level, that we all know we're working from like the same basis of truth.
I didn't realize that in France, it's the same standard curriculum, no matter what college you
Yeah.
go to.
I know like in high school, you take like a big test. It is extremely standardized up through high school level. But even in college, there is like this idea of like culturally, this is the French education.
Fascinating.
I think there is something to be said for that. I wish we had a system that would allow that, but unfortunately, we kind of don't.
You're saying there's no room for like both vocational training for a specific career and a college education that provides a general shared liberal arts education.
Yeah, because the cost of education is so high to say, like, I'm doing this for personal development versus I'm doing this for job training. For people looking to go to college to make a certain amount of money, it's a vocational thing. The question of if it's worth it or not is really challenged by boot camps and other like vocational schools because the cost difference and your earning potential after is getting a lot better. So most boot camps are boasting 90% employment rate 1 year after graduation, which like what university can give you those kind of numbers?
You're talking like software engineering boot camp specifically, or like what do you mean when you say boot camp?
Yeah, these are ones specific to data science, software engineering, UI, UX design, and web design. So
Okay.
anything related to like the software ecosystem. Usually these boot camps take 3 to 6 months to complete, way shorter than your 4 year education, and they typically cost between $10,000 and $20,000. So right there, so many positives to doing this.
How do you get in? Do you need a college degree or no?
You don't. It's not required. It helps you to get into one, but it's really just like an interview process. They try to make sure that you have the interpersonal skills to get hired after, because like obviously it affects their numbers. But yeah, the caveat here is even though it's not required to have a college education, 75% of bootcamp grads do have a bachelor's degree or higher. So it's tough. You can't really say that there's a one-to-one connection of like, yeah, these boot camps are a good alternative to college.
Right.
Probably a good supplement. But I do think that this is going to be, especially with the younger generation being so weary of getting themselves into so much college debt, that this is going to be a real contender and like change the landscape of how people think about going to school or not.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like the type of student making that type of decision is really different than the one who is considering either the apprenticeship or trade school route, which is usually more of an alternative to college rather than supplemental the way that a coding boot camp is. And I saw this article that was like, Gen Z is picking trade schools over colleges. And it's true that we are seeing college enrollment decrease. The stats are that between 1979 and 2010, enrollment at both 2 and 4 year colleges more than doubled to 18 million. That was about a 2% growth rate every year. And then since 2010, it has fallen by about 2 million, which is a decline of 1.5%. And that decrease is really being driven by 2-year programs, both public and for profit. So 2-year public colleges decreased by 38% between 2010 and 2021, and for-profit private colleges which we haven't even gotten into yet, decreased by 59%. Because now I think many people realize that those colleges are very predatory and they actually cost more and deliver worse results for students. So actually, we see all these big headlines that say like enrollment is decreasing, but it's really enrollment at these 2-year schools. Enrollment at 4-year private and public colleges increased. So public colleges increased by 15% and 4-year nonprofit colleges increased by 2%. So I think what that shows is that it's really a very specific type of student who is no longer going to college. A person who is selecting to go to a 4-year school is probably in a really different set of circumstances to someone doing a 2-year program. I mean, a huge driver of how long you're in school is cost. And so it's these students who are considering, well, it might make more sense for me to get an apprenticeship or go to trade school instead.
That makes so much sense. So much
Yeah.
sense. Because you see all the time these headlines about how much plumbers are making, how much electricians are making. They're making like well over 6-figure salaries. And there's just so much need. Like I keep seeing this need for like welders, specifically underwater welders. And the salaries for them are like close to $200,000. So people obviously, when you're looking at that and being like, do I not go to college and just do one of these trades? Versus getting a 2-year associate's degree and then like, yeah, having a desk job, but maybe making like 30 to 50K. The math isn't mathing on that one. It really does make sense.
Apparently, the fastest growing job in the US right now is wind turbine service technician.
Oh my God.
Which pays $100,000 a year. Yeah. But then I was like, okay, but it's also hazard pay, right? The wind service technician, they're literally climbing up those turbines with like all that equipment. I mean, that's why construction pays so much too, because it's hazard pay.
They do feel like very male centered vocations too.
Totally. And men are the ones not going to college anymore. So when I was looking at college enrollment declining, there's actually a huge gap in terms of gender. Men accounted for 71% of the decline. So at the end of 2021, women made up about 60% of college students, an all-time high, and men made up 40%.
Wow.
They were literally saying if this trend continues, that for every degree a man earns, there'll be 2 women earning degrees. And that's likely to happen in the next few years.
No, I knew that like gap was happening. I didn't know it was so big, but that kind of reminds me, I keep seeing these headlines about how there's a huge political gap between men and women in the younger generations right now too, where women are more liberal than men who are becoming slowly more conservative. And we know that college educated individuals tend to be more liberal. So I wonder if this is going to contribute to that as well, just like a differing in philosophies and understandings of the world just by like pure fact of having college educations and not.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because no one really understands why. I mean, the article I was reading in the Wall Street Journal that talked about this said maybe it's because men feel more pressure to be the provider, and so maybe they're taking a path that would allow them to make money more quickly than if they went to a 2-year school. But in terms of the gender gap, I was like, oh, maybe this is a good thing because women weren't even admitted into college until the mid-1800s. So are we right-sizing? And if more women are educated, more women will be in power, and maybe it'll balance out some of the historical imbalance. But then I was reading this article and they were like, yeah, because there's less men, there's schools where it's easier to be a man and get into school now.
What?
Yeah. It's like affirmative action towards men, which is like crazy to me.
Crazy.
Literally this quote from this person who works in admissions. She said, "This kind of tacit affirmative action for boys has become higher education's dirty little secret. Practiced but not publicly acknowledged by many private universities where the gender balance has gone off kilter."
Wow. But why is that a bad thing? For how many years were there more men than women in universities by like humongous percentages?
It really is wild. And at Baylor University, the admission rate for men in 2020 was actually 7 percentage points higher than that for women, which is huge.
Yeah, that's so much.
And okay, to circle back to what we were initially talking about, it is these 2-year programs that are declining. It's men that are declining. And as best we can tell, trade schools and apprenticeships are gaining students. There's not a lot of data on trade schools. This organization called the National Student Clearinghouse started tracking enrollment in trade schools in 2018. And they reported that between spring 2021 to 2022, they saw an enrollment increase of 11.5% for mechanic and repair trade programs, a 19% increase in construction courses and a 13% increase in culinary program enrollment. And then anecdotally, when it comes to apprenticeships, I read this article about this woman who she had two options. She had like a full ride to go to a 4-year institution, and she had an offer at this company called Aon. It's a consulting firm, but she had like an offer for their apprenticeship program. And when she sat down with her family to have the conversation about which she should take, her family advised her to take the apprenticeship.
Wow.
They felt like it was safer to have guaranteed employment after the apprenticeship program. And if you just take a look at even that apprenticeship program that she did that program when it began in 2016. And that year, they accepted 40% of applicants. In 2023, that same program, the applicant pool grew to 1,500 for 100 positions, which is a 7% acceptance rate, which is the same as like Cornell and Dartmouth, like top tier universities. So you're seeing like big demand for these apprenticeship opportunities. And I think some of the reasons are like what we've been discussing. It just feels like way more of a sure thing if one of the main things you're solving for is to have financial stability.
Totally.
So as a percentage of the US working population, apprentice numbers are still tiny, even though they've been growing recently. So it's 0.6% of the US working population. And for a comparison, I looked specifically at France, and it's 2%. So it's really small still, but it's still 4 times what it is in the United States. That might not even be capturing the full picture of people who are opting for these trade schools. Because if you're studying in a culinary high school, what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, you're not an apprentice, right? So you wouldn't be captured in that stat. I just feel like there's so much more acceptance in European countries of these alternative paths of education, or I guess you wouldn't call it education, but these alternative ways to get a job.
Vocational training.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. There definitely is. And I think to your point, like a very positive thing, because people aren't left out. Like you're not like lesser than for not going to college. You just chose a different path. And I think that's really positive because it doesn't force people who like know that college isn't their end all be all for what they want to do in life. Like you have this really valid alternative path for you already laid out. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah. And now it seems like people in the US, the younger generation, are waking up to the fact that there are other options that are valid.
Yeah, completely. I think we have Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg to thank for a lot of the changing in this. Peter Thiel, people that are like, you know what, you don't need a college education to be incredibly successful. And I know everyone's going to say, well, they were Harvard dropouts. It's a little bit different. But I think the point still stands.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other thing. I mean, Peter Thiel is paying people to drop out of college. So that doesn't mean you had to be in college to start.
That's true.
You had to get in. And so for our audience, like Peter Thiel is this successful tech entrepreneur. He's a venture investor. He has this program where he pays students $100,000 to drop out of college. And it's based on, this classic, I don't want to say myth because it obviously happens, but it's definitely like overblown in the media of these like usually male tech boy geniuses who like drop out of school and found these like billion-dollar companies. But I'm pretty sure a lot of those people he's funding, they are going to elite colleges.
No, absolutely. But I say that to say I think it's become more acceptable now, even with the internet and like ways that you can self-educate and like proliferation of tech. Is there a path for me to make a lot more money on the internet, not having gone to university?
Totally.
Then there is taking that traditional path. It is becoming more flexible. And I think even when we were making that decision at 17, 18, and you can sort of build a resume online in a way that like you can prove yourself better than somebody who just like went to college and like has a degree behind their name. You can be like, look at my profile of work on the internet. Like I can prove to you already. Yeah.
I mean, now that we are in the world that we are in, do you think if you were to have kids, what would you tell them? Would you tell them like, you should definitely go to college? Is 100% worth it? Or would you maybe offer them some alternative options? What would you hope for your kids?
I would hope for my kids that if they chose a vocation and they wanted to do something that did not require a college degree, I would still encourage them to go, but just study something that they were passionate about, that they were interested in. I'm still with Einstein on this one, where it's like teaching you how to think. I'm like, that's valuable. If I couldn't pay for it, if college got so expensive that I couldn't pay for them to go do that and they had to go into debt to do it, I would say don't do it. Like just try your best. Or if they were like going into a profession that they absolutely needed a degree, then I would say like, yeah, do it. But damn, I think there's like so many other ways now.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty confident, hopeful that I'll be able to pay for my kids' college. So hopefully it won't be an issue. But how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I loved college so much. I think the reasons I loved it, yeah, to your point, was not necessarily because of what I remember I learned in class, but more just like for the experience and having a class that you enter with and you make friends and you kind of learn how to be an adult for the first time. So I think all of that is really important. Now, I do think my perspective has changed a lot since when I was a kid between what I used to think was the pinnacle, like the Harvard, the Ivy League education, versus a school like Michigan, which is a public school. I feel like I've totally flipped on that. I think it's actually way better to go to a public school where there's like way more diversity. There's just a bigger student body. So there's a lot more niches that can develop. And also, I think it's like less of a privileged environment. Like, obviously, I didn't go to an Ivy League, but now in my life, since I did work in consulting after school, a lot of my colleagues did come from, the Harvard, Yale, Princetons of the world. And I feel like a lot of what I heard from their experience was like, it's extremely privileged. Like, a lot of the students are just really rich. And like, I don't know if they're getting in because of their family connections or donations or whatever, but like, that's certainly much more of a thing. Whereas I think in public school, you just have the opportunity to like be surrounded by so many different types of peers. And I think there's like less of that elitist culture. And I think that can be really beneficial. If I were to have kids, I would encourage my kids to really weigh that with just as much importance as the brand or like the type of education you think you're getting. Because I do think nowadays, I mean, of course, you get a great education at Harvard, but I also think even a community college, right? Like, I think if you're the kind of student who really does want to learn, even if like your school doesn't have the highest endowment or like the most funding, your professors aren't like Nobel laureates, that's okay. You can actually still seek out similar resources to what the really privileged kids are getting, and you can do the learning on your own. And I do think the playing field has leveled if you're willing to put in the work to find those resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Well, I think we should just have college for all. So hopefully somebody just erases the student loan debt. We make it free and you can go if you want to. And this question of debt and complete elitism just washes it.
Yeah.
Washes away. That's what I hope for the future generation. We'll see if we can make that happen.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Full transcripts and show notes are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.